Council witnessed humanity's predator mode unleashed live. The translator bead in Rael Das's ear had been malfunctioning since the second hour of the session. It kept cutting out mid-sentence, dropping whole words from the Heth delegate's speech, turning careful diplomatic language into broken noise. Rael had stopped relying on it an hour ago. She had been reading the room instead, watching the body language of 40 species who all thought they were being subtle, and none of them were. That was the thing about being human on a galactic council. Everyone underestimated how much you were paying attention. Vareth 9 was a neutral station, old by most standards, shaped like a wide ring around a pale orange gas giant that nobody had bothered to name. The council chamber sat in the station's inner arc, a tiered bowl of curved seating and soft white light, designed by a species that had 6 eyes and found harsh lighting physically painful. Everything here was gentle. The air was filtered to a temperature that satisfied no one species completely but offended none of them. The seats were adjustable to over 200 body configurations. The whole place had been built as a statement: we can share a room without hurting each other. Rael sat in the human seat, which was still technically marked provisional, a small indignity she had stopped noticing. Beside her was Saru, the Ventari ambassador, a tall being with smooth, pale skin and dark, wide eyes that caught light like wet stone. Saru had been Rael's unofficial guide through council culture for the past 2 years. He had once spent 40 minutes explaining to her why it was considered rude among the Heth to stand while speaking, and why it was considered equally rude among the Orvani to sit. He had found the contradiction deeply distressing. Rael had found it useful. Understanding contradictions was most of the job. Across the chamber, seated in the observer's tier rather than the delegate ring, was Gaul. He was Drakshi, broad and dark-scaled with a soldier's habit of keeping his back to the wall. His species had 3 wars in living memory, and a policy of attending every major council event with a military-trained observer. Gaul was that observer, and he was not subtle about his opinions. He had, within the first 10 minutes of the session, leaned over to a colleague and said something that Rael's working translator had rendered as rough meat sitting at the table of the old ones. She was fairly sure he meant humans. She had not reacted. Reacting would have confirmed that she heard it. Not reacting confirmed nothing at all. The session itself was about the border stretch between Heth and Orvani space, a corridor of uninhabited systems that both sides had decided were suddenly important. It was the kind of dispute that sounded simple and was not. Territory in space was not like territory on a planet. You could not walk it. You could not see where one piece of nothing ended and another began. What you were really arguing about was access and trade lanes and who got to say no to whom. Rael had prepared for this. She had 4 proposals in her notes that she thought could satisfy both parties without either side losing face. She had not been called on yet, but she was ready. Saru passed her a small data slate with a quietly written note. The Heth delegate had just invoked the covenant of prior passage, which was either a brilliant move or a catastrophic one depending on how the Orvani chose to interpret it. Rael read the note, glanced at the Orvani bench, and watched the lead Orvani delegate's secondary throat membrane flutter in a way that Saru had once told her meant deep offense. She wrote back on the slate, "They are going to walk out in about 4 minutes." Saru read it. His eyes went wide. She was right. What she did not write, because it was not helpful yet, was that she had also noticed something else. A small thing, a detail that did not fit. The station ran on a quiet hum. Not loud, just present, a constant low vibration you stopped noticing after the first hour. It was the sound of Vareth 9 doing what it always did, circulating air, managing pressure, running docking control on the outer ring. Rael had stopped noticing it consciously, but something in the last few minutes had changed. The hum had a slightly different texture, not louder. Just different in the way that a familiar sound becomes unfamiliar when one of its layers goes missing. The outer docking ring had gone quiet. Rael set down her stylus. She did not move quickly. She did not look around in a way that would draw attention. She just sat back slightly in her chair and let her eyes move across the room once, slowly, the way a person does when they are stretching their neck. She counted exits. She noted where the Scareth observation unit was sitting, a small delegation of 3 that the council allowed as neutral trade observers, and that Rail had always found it strange to trust. She looked at the maintenance door on the east wall, which had opened twice in the past hour for station staff, and which had not opened in the last 20 minutes despite the fact that the environmental readout above it was showing a pressure fluctuation that someone should have come to check by now. Nobody else in the room had noticed any of this. Saru was watching the Orvani delegate stand up in controlled fury. Gaul was watching the Heth delegation with professional assessment. The rest of the council was watching the drama at the center floor. Rail watched the door. Her heart rate had climbed. She could feel it, a familiar response, old and biological and honest, but her hands were still. Her breathing was even. The part of her that was afraid was real and present and completely separate from the part of her that was already working the problem. 3 seconds of fear. Then only the problem. The Orvani delegate said something sharp and final. The chamber erupted in urgent side conversations. Nobody was watching the maintenance door when the light above it changed from green to off. Rail noted it. She said nothing, not yet. But she moved her chair 2 inches to the left, which gave her a clear line of sight to the door and a clear path to the aisle. Small adjustments, nothing visible. She was ready before the room knew it needed to be. They came in through the maintenance corridor on the east wall, exactly where Rail had been watching. Not 1 or 2, 12 of them, moving in a tight formation that spoke of practice, of repetition, of a team that had done this kind of thing before and found it easy. They were Scareth, a species that the Council's official records described as a spacefaring mercantile culture, and that anyone who had spent real time near the outer trade lanes described as something closer to organized predators. Long limbs, gray-brown plating over the chest and shoulders, eyes that sat wide on a flat face and caught movement well. They were built like something that had once chased things across open ground a long time ago and had never quite lost the shape of it. They had weapons, compact, short-range, the kind designed for enclosed spaces. The Council's no-weapons policy on neutral stations was, it turned out, only enforceable if the people you were trying to enforce it against cared about Council policy. The one at the front was larger than the others. A scar ran from his left jaw down to where his neck plating began. He stopped in the center of the chamber floor, looked at the full assembly with the calm of someone doing a job, and spoke in galactic common loud enough that no translator bead was needed. Every delegate will remain seated. This station is now under Scareth authority. You are guests of the Drevok Company until terms are negotiated. For a moment the room simply did not process it. Then it did. What happened next was something Rail had read about in xenobiology reports, but had never seen at this scale. 40 species in a room, most of them from worlds that had not faced direct physical violence in living memory, and all of them responding to sudden threat in the ways their bodies had decided mattered long before their civilizations got polite enough to forget about it. The Orvani delegate dropped below the table edge so fast his chair spun backward. The Heth cluster folded inward, bodies pressing together in their instinctive group contact response. A small Pelori representative near the back of the room made a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a whistle and went completely rigid, which was apparently what Pelori bodies did under extreme stress. Several delegates simply froze in place. One began trembling hard enough that the table in front of him rattled. Saru grabbed Rail's arm. His fingers were cold. His wide, dark eyes had gone wider. "Rail," he said very quietly, "what do we do?" It was not phrased as a question. It was the sound of a person handing a problem to someone they trusted to know the answer. Rail did not answer immediately. She was still looking at the room, not at Saru, Not at Drevok, at the room, all of it at once. Her posture had changed. It was a small thing, hard to name exactly. She had not stood up. She had not raised her voice. She had not done anything sudden or dramatic, but something about the way she held herself had shifted, a fraction lower, a fraction more still, the way water goes quiet before it moves fast. The tension that had been in her shoulders during the long diplomatic session was gone, replaced by something that was not relaxed but was more dangerous than relaxed, a loose readiness. Like a mechanism that had just been unlocked. Gall saw it. He was trained to notice these things. 3 wars and a career spent assessing threats had given him the habit of watching how people changed under pressure rather than just watching what they did. He had looked at Rael Das twice during the session and filed her as non-threatening, soft-postured, the kind of species that negotiated because it had no better options. He looked at her now and revised that assessment completely. She was not panicking. She was not frozen. She was not looking for someone to tell her what to do. Her eyes were moving across the room with a speed and precision that he recognized from soldiers checking fields of fire, and she was doing it without moving her head enough for the Scarath to notice she was doing it. She was counting them. She was mapping the exits. She was doing, without any apparent training or instruction, exactly what Gall had spent years learning to do in the first seconds of a hostile situation. He found this deeply unsettling. Drevok walked the center of the chamber slowly, letting his people fan out to the walls. He was not rushed. He had clearly done the math on this room and liked his numbers. 40-odd delegates, no weapons, a species roster that included nothing with significant combat capability. A clean job. He had not done much research on humans. Rael, still seated, still holding Saru's hand in a way that looked like reassurance, said nothing. But her free hand had moved beneath the table edge and was now resting against the surface of the council broadcast panel built into every delegate's station. It was a panel designed for submitting formal statements to the chamber record. It had a secondary function that almost no one ever used, because almost no one ever needed to, which was that it could reroute the station's internal visual feeds to all screens on all levels simultaneously. Rael knew about the secondary function because she had read the full technical specification of the chamber on her first day. She had thought, at the time, that it was probably useless information. She kept that kind of information anyway. Humans did, you never knew. She looked at the east maintenance door. She looked at the station map she had memorized. She thought about Pav, her aide, who had stepped out 15 minutes before the Scarath arrived to find a charging station for his data pad. She thought about Dora, the station maintenance engineer who had been working on a conduit panel 2 corridors down and who had a full engineering access badge. Rael did not have a plan yet. She had something better than a plan. She had pieces, and she knew how pieces worked, and she was very calmly, very quietly, fitting them together while Drevok announced terms to a room full of frightened aliens who were looking at the armed soldiers in front of them. Rael was not looking at the soldiers. She was looking at the ceiling panel in the corner where the atmospheric control intake was mounted, and she was thinking about pressure differentials, and she was almost smiling. Pav was 23 years old and had spent most of his diplomatic career fetching things, organizing things, and making sure the right person had the right document at the right time. He was good at it. He was patient, detail-oriented, and had a memory for names and faces that Rael had found useful on 3 separate occasions. He had never been in a crisis before. But he had grown up in a city where the power went out 6 nights a week and the water supply was unreliable for half the year, and his mother had a rule for those nights. Keep your eyes open, keep your mouth shut, and do what needs doing. He was crouched behind a supply cart in the corridor, outside the main hall, when Rael's first signal reached him. It was not a message. Messages could be intercepted. It was a single blink of the corridor's secondary lighting, a maintenance-level flicker that would read as a minor power fluctuation to any monitoring system, which happened to be the exact pattern that Rail had shown him once during a long transit between stations, saying casually, "If things ever go wrong in a building and I need you to come to me without being seen, this is what it looks like." He had laughed at the time. He had asked if she was being serious. She had looked at him with that patient expression she used when she wanted him to understand something without having to say it twice. He had memorized the pattern. Now he moved. Dora was not someone who panicked. She was 41, had worked station maintenance across 6 different systems, and had once spent 9 hours in a sealed conduit section during a pressure failure with nothing but a hand torch and a thermos of cold coffee. She had a straightforward relationship with dangerous situations. Assess, act. Do not waste energy on feelings until the immediate problem is solved. She had heard the Scareth come through the east corridor before she saw them, recognized the sound of armored movement, and had simply pressed herself flat against the wall inside the maintenance alcove and waited. She was waiting when the light in the corridor blinked in a pattern she had not seen before. She blinked at it. Then she looked at the engineering panel in front of her, which showed the full atmospheric layout of the station's inner ring, and she began to understand what someone was suggesting. Rail, still seated at the delegate table with Saru's cold hand in hers, had now broadcast a very short series of sounds through the chamber's ambient audio system. To alien ears it was feedback noise, a brief malfunction in the translator system, which happened often enough that no one looked alarmed. To Pav, who was now positioned near the service entrance on the west side of the hall, and to Dora, who had cracked the maintenance alcove door an inch and was listening, it was a sequence with meaning. Timing, position, 1 move each. That was how humans coordinated under pressure when they could not speak openly, not with technology, not with encoded transmissions, with shared context built up quietly over time between people who had been paying attention. Drevok had placed 4 of his soldiers near the chamber's main entrance and spread the rest along the walls. It was a solid formation. It covered the obvious exits, kept the delegates boxed in, and put the heaviest firepower at the front. It was designed for a room full of species that would stay where they were told. Rail triggered the Council broadcasting system's secondary function. Every screen in the station lit up with the chamber's internal feed. Every corridor, every service room, every waiting area now showed the Council hall in real time. Drevok had not anticipated this. None of his people had. For 3 seconds, every Scareth in the room looked at the screens, trying to understand why the station was showing them to themselves. It was 3 seconds. It was enough. Pav came through the service entrance fast and low. He had no weapon. He did not need one, or rather, he had understood since childhood that in a small space, the weapon is almost always the wrong tool if you are fast enough and the other person is not expecting you. He crossed the distance to the nearest Scareth guard in the time it took the guard to turn from the screen. What happened next was brief and ungraceful and completely effective. The guard's weapon was on the floor. The guard was on the floor. Pav had 3 bruised fingers and a split lip, and was already moving to the wall, picking up the weapon, checking it in the practiced way of someone who had grown up somewhere that made knowing how a weapon worked a survival skill rather than a hobby. Alien delegates pressed behind tables stared at him with open shock. Saru, still beside Rail, made a sound that his translator rendered as impossible, and then revised to that actually happened. At the same moment, in the corridor behind the main Scareth formation, Dora did what Dora did, which was engineering. The atmospheric pressure in the outer corridor dropped sharply. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to seal the emergency blast panels that Vareth 9's designers had built into every section junction. The panels that the Scareth had propped open on their way and slammed shut. The corridor behind them was gone. Their communications to any external ship, which ran through a relay in that corridor, dropped to static. The 12 Scareth who had walked into this chamber expecting a simple job were now sealed inside it. Drevok realized what had happened about 5 seconds after it was too late to matter. He turned to Rael. She was standing now, finally, unhurried, the way someone stands when they have been waiting to stand for a while and have finally decided the moment is right. She was unarmed. She was shorter than him by a significant margin. She had done nothing physically violent. She had pressed a button and blinked some lights and made small sounds that sounded like static. And his operation was in ruins. He raised his weapon at her. His hand was steady. Drevok had done enough of these jobs to stay cold when they went wrong. Rael looked at the weapon. Then she looked at him. Something in her face was very quiet and very certain, and it was not the face of someone looking at a weapon pointed at them. It was the face of someone who had already moved past that problem and was now working on the next one. Saru would later spend a long time trying to describe that expression to colleagues who had not been in the room. The closest he could get, in any language he spoke, was, she had already decided how it ended. The screens were still live. Dora, from inside the maintenance alcove, had not switched them off. She had made a deliberate choice to leave every feed running, which meant that everything that happened next in the council chamber was broadcast to every corridor, waiting room, service bay, and crew station on Vareth 9 in real time. 4200 station residents watched on wall panels and personal screens, and the small displays mounted above doorways. Some of them watched alone. Some gathered in clusters, pressed close together, saying nothing. What they watched was this. Drevok fired. He had meant it as a warning shot, aimed wide, the kind of thing designed to establish that he was serious, and that the human standing across the chamber from him should sit down and stop whatever she was doing. The shot hit the wall panel 2 feet to Rael's right and left a dark burn mark in the composite surface. Rael had already moved before the shot landed, not away from it, sideways, a short, economical shift of her weight that took her out of the line and behind the nearest delegate table in the same motion, and it was the kind of movement that did not look fast in isolation, but had covered real distance by the time anyone fully registered it had happened. Gaul pressed against the wall in the observer's tier with his arms at his sides, and his expression doing something it had never done before in his professional life, which was being entirely unable to settle on a useful assessment, watched her move, and felt something he would not admit to until much later, which was that he was relieved the human was on the same side as the delegates. Rael did not stay behind the table. She had used it for 1 second, the 1 second she needed to read the new positions of the Scareth nearest to her, and then she was moving again. The Scareth had spread along the walls, and the formation that had looked solid 10 minutes ago now had a problem. The delegates they had expected to stay in neat rows were not in neat rows anymore. They were scattered, pressed into corners, behind furniture, against walls, a chaotic scatter of shapes and sounds that broke up sightlines and made the room hard to read at speed. Drevok had planned for compliant hostages. What he had was a room full of frightened aliens that moved unpredictably, and one human who moved very predictably indeed, which was always toward the next objective and never in a straight line. The second Scareth guard went down near the north wall. Nobody watching on screen could quite reconstruct how it happened. There were 2 seconds of movement too fast to follow cleanly, a crash, and then Rael was 3 feet further into the room and the guard was not standing. She had picked up nothing. She was still unarmed. She had used the guard's own forward momentum, which Gaul recognized as a technique his own species had abandoned 3 centuries ago in favor of better weapons, and which was apparently not abandoned by everyone. The third guard was smarter. He waited. He let her come into the space where he had a clear angle and he fired. She was not there when the shot went through the space she had just occupied. She had dropped low in the half-second before he pulled the trigger, which should not have been possible because she could not have seen the shot coming, except that she had apparently read the guard's body language well enough in advance to know that the trigger pull was coming, and had moved for the floor before the decision to fire had fully finished traveling down his arm. This was, Gall thought, with the distant clarity of a soldier watching a thing he could not quite believe, not training. You could not train a person to read a body that precisely in the middle of a moving, noisy, chaotic room. This was something older. This was the product of a species that had spent a very long time being chased and had gotten very good at reading the moment just before something tried to kill it. She was not just surviving. She was taking the room apart in sequence, working from the outside in, neutralizing the perimeter guards first and leaving the center, where Drevok was, for last. It was a strategy. Not a reactive scramble, not desperation, a strategy, and she was executing it without stopping to think because she had thought it all the way through already, in the time between Drevok raising his weapon and firing the first shot. Pav, near the west wall with the recovered weapon, was covering the main door. His hands were completely still. His face was pale but focused. Alien delegates crouched near him kept looking at him with expressions that mixed relief and bafflement in roughly equal measure, because here was a young human who looked like he had been hired to carry bags, and was currently holding a weapon with the ease of someone who had known how this device worked long before today. Gall noticed that too. 4 guards down, then 6, then 8, each one quick, each one final, no wasted time, no drama. The chamber was loud with the sounds of frightened aliens and the specific silence of Scareth guards who had stopped being a problem. Drevok was the last one. He had his weapon up. He was not panicking. He was experienced enough to know that panicking made you slow, and slow was how you lost. He tracked Rail across the chamber as she moved, trying to lead her next position, trying to predict her. The problem was that predicting her required understanding her, and understanding her required a model of how humans behaved under threat that Drevok did not have and could not build in real time. She came at him from the left and slightly below his sight line, which was not where she had been moving, and the feed cut out for 11 seconds. Not because Dora cut it, because a power relay near the chamber's east junction spiked when one of the earlier weapon discharges hit a panel, and the screens went dark for 11 seconds, and those 11 seconds were the most discussed gap in footage in the station's history for the next several months. When the feed came back, Drevok was on the floor, both wrists locked behind him with a length of cable that had come from somewhere. He was breathing. His weapon was on the other side of the chamber, nowhere near him. Rail was standing. She had a cut on her left forearm, not deep, and she had folded a piece of her jacket into a rough pad and was pressing it against the cut with calm, practiced economy. Her breathing was slightly elevated. Her expression was the same expression she had been wearing since the first shot was fired, which was the expression of a person who has a lot left on their list and is working through it. Around the chamber, silence. Not the silence of nothing happening. The silence of 40 species who had just watched something that none of their categories had a word for. Saru was standing with both his hands pressed flat against his chest, which was a Ventari gesture that meant, roughly, I have witnessed something that has changed the size of what I thought was possible. He stood like that for a long time. Station security arrived 11 minutes after the Scareth jamming dropped. 11 minutes was fast, by the standard response logic of a neutral diplomatic station that had not expected to need a fast response. The security chief, a drav named Ol Hessa, came through the main entrance with 14 officers and a medical team, and stopped just inside the door. The chamber looked like the aftermath of something significant. Overturned furniture, burn marks on 2 walls, 12 Scareth, all restrained, none dead, sitting in a loose cluster near the center of the floor. 40-odd alien delegates in various states of distress, some still pressed behind tables, some sitting in the open with the glazed look of people whose nervous systems were still catching up. A young human near the west wall holding a Scareth weapon with the barrel pointed safely at the floor. A human woman in maintenance coveralls entering from the east service door with grease on her hands and a calm expression. And Rael Das, sitting on the edge of the delegate table, jacket off, a field medic's wrap already half applied to her forearm that she appeared to have started applying herself. Olhessa stood in the doorway for a full 4 seconds. Then she said, in galactic common, "We received a security alert 40 minutes ago. The jamming prevented response. Can someone explain what I am looking at?" Rael looked up from her arm. "Scareth boarding action," she said. 12 personnel, 1 confirmed commander, all secured. No delegate casualties. The Scareth communication relay in the outer corridor is sealed off, so any ship they came from is still waiting and doesn't know the job failed. You have a window to intercept it if you move in the next 30 minutes. Olhessa stared at her. Then she began issuing orders into her communicator. The medical team spread through the chamber. Most of the work was shock and stress response, species whose physiologies expressed extreme fear through sustained hormonal flooding needed time, and sometimes intervention to return to baseline. The Pelori delegate had to be gently coaxed out of her rigid freeze state. Several of the Heth representatives needed thermal support for their circulatory response. Saru sat with a warming wrap around his shoulders and held both his own hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance. A junior medic approached Rael to finish the arm wrap. Rael let her work. She was reviewing something on her data pad with the other hand. Gall walked over. He did not ask permission. He stood in front of her in the way that soldiers stand when they want an answer and are willing to wait for it. His arms were at his sides. His expression was not unfriendly. It was the expression of a professional who has observed something outside his existing framework and would like the framework updated. "How did you do it?" he said. Rael looked up. She considered the question with evident seriousness, the way she considered most questions, as if the accurate answer mattered more than the comfortable one. "Which part?" she said. "All of it, any of it." Gall paused. "Your species has no military presence on this station. You held no weapon. You had no preparation time. You neutralized 12 armed combatants, and you did it in a room full of chaos with no clear sightlines." He paused again. "I have fought in 3 wars. I have assessed combat capability for my government for 19 years. What I watched you do does not fit any category I have." Rael was quiet for a moment. The medic finished the arm wrap and moved off. Rael set down her pad. "We don't have a special program," she said. "There's no conditioning, no implant, no classified training track for diplomats." She thought about how to say the next part. "Humans come from a world that was trying to kill us for most of the time we existed on it, not metaphorically, literally. Every generation for hundreds of thousands of years was born into an environment with things larger and faster that ate them, diseases that moved through populations without warning, weather that killed whole regions. And we were not the biggest or the fastest or the strongest thing on the ground." She looked at him. "So we became the most aware, the most adaptive. We got very good at reading threats before they moved and finding solutions in environments where most of the options were already gone." Gall said nothing. "Every human alive today," Rael continued, "is descended from a very long line of people who did not die when something tried to kill them. That's not training. That's just what we are." Pav, who had been quietly returning the Scareth weapon to Olhessa's team nearby, heard this and added, without turning around, "We also just genuinely hate losing." Saru made a sound from under his warming wrap that might have been a laugh. Gall looked at Pav, then at Rael, then at Dora, who had sat down against the far wall with her thermos of coffee and was annotating something on a maintenance schematic with the energy of a person who had done an interesting morning's work and was now doing documentation. He sat down in the empty chair beside Rael's table, not the chair of a superior officer, the chair of someone who needed a moment. "Were you frightened?" he said, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. Rael looked at him. "Yes," she said, "for the first 3 seconds, right when they came through the door. And then I had a problem to solve." She picked up her data pad again. Fear is useful information. It tells you the threat is real. You register it and then you put it somewhere it won't slow you down. She scrolled something. The problem was more urgent than the feeling. Gall sat with that for a while. Around them, the medical teams worked. The Scareth prisoners were processed. Ulhessa's security officers took statements from delegates who were, in many cases, still not entirely sure what they had witnessed. The station's communication logs were already showing an explosion of outgoing messages, 42 species sending reports to their home governments, all of which contained some version of the same information. The humans had done something that did not have a name in most of their languages. Gall looked at the burn mark on the wall where Drevok's warning shot had hit, 2 feet to the right of where Rael had been standing. She had moved before the shot. He had watched it at real speed and still did not fully believe it. He thought about what it meant to evolve on a world that never let you be safe. To carry that world with you in your blood and your reflexes into a galaxy that had, over centuries, gotten comfortable and slow, and absolutely unprepared for the possibility that the quiet species with no visible weapons was the most dangerous thing in any room it walked into. He thought about 19 years of assessments. He thought, I have made a significant error. 3 days later, the footage had been watched across 47 star systems. Not broadcast officially. The Council did not have an official position on it yet, but Dora had rerouted those feeds to every screen on Verath 9, and Verath 9 had a crew of 4,000, and 4,000 people have personal devices, and personal devices connect to wider networks. And within 18 hours, the 11-second gap in the footage had already become the most discussed 11 seconds of video in the local cluster. People watched the part before the gap and the part after, and they argued about what had happened in between, and they watched Rael press a folded piece of jacket against her arm and look at nothing in particular with that expression on her face, and they could not stop watching it. The Council reconvened in a chamber that had been repaired with impressive speed by Dora and her maintenance team, who had worked through 2 sleep cycles without being asked, and who had quietly fixed more than just the damage from the firefight, patching old faults in the wall panels, and resealing the East Corridor junction properly for the first time in what the station logs indicated was several years. The Scareth prisoners were in secure custody. Drevok was facing tribunal. The ship they had arrived on had been intercepted within the window Rael had estimated, because Ulhessa had moved quickly and the window had been real. The territorial dispute between the Heth and the Orvani was still technically on the agenda. It had been moved to Item 3. Item 1 was a motion that several delegate groups had filed jointly and with unusual speed, given that the relevant parties were still recovering from stress responses when they submitted it. The motion had 2 parts. The first was a formal request to reclassify Humanity's Provisional Council seat as permanent, with full voting rights, effective immediately. The second was a proposal to review the Council's existing intelligence assessments of Earth as a species and amend them, specifically the section that described humans as a moderate capability biological species with limited threat profile and no significant military cultural development. That section had been in the record for 60 years. The chamber was full again, repaired seating, the same soft light, 40 species in their places. Rael sat in the human seat, which someone had quietly removed the provisional marker from sometime in the past 72 hours. She had not commented on it. She had brought a revised set of proposals for the Heth-Orvani border question and was intending to present them under Item 3. Before the motion came to vote, the floor was open for statements. Most of the delegates who spoke addressed the motion in the formal language of Council procedure, citing the events of 3 days ago as evidence of value, of capability, of contribution to galactic stability. It was careful and considered and appropriate. Then Gall spoke. He did not have a vote. He was an observer. He had no formal standing on any motion before this body. He stood at the floor anyway, and nobody asked him to sit down, because something in his posture communicated that he had something to say that was worth the interruption to process. He was quiet for a moment first. He looked around the chamber. He looked at the burn mark on the north wall that the repair crew had somehow missed, or perhaps left, because a clean patch on new composite was hard to miss and maybe someone had decided it should stay. I have assessed the combat capability of 112 species over the course of my career, he said. I have submitted formal evaluations to my government on every significant species this council has admitted in the past 2 decades. I assessed humanity 4 years ago. I submitted a report that described them as low physical threat, non-aggressive, limited crisis response capability. He paused. That report was wrong, not in detail, wrong in its foundations. I was measuring humans against the wrong standard. I was looking for the things my training told me to look for: weapons, armor, formation, physical scale. I was not looking for what humans actually are. He looked at Rael, who was watching him with her pen still in her hand. What I watched 3 days ago was not exceptional. That is the important thing to understand. Delegate Das is not a special case. She is not a trained soldier or a classified operative. She is what the average human being is under pressure when something threatens the people in the room with her. The chamber was still. The question this council has been asking about humans is whether they deserve a seat at the table. That is the wrong question. The right question is whether you understand what you invited to the table when you gave them the provisional chair. He looked around the room again. Humans evolved on a world that never let them be safe. Not once, not for a generation. Everything they are, the awareness, the adaptability, the ability to solve problems in real time with no resources, the thing that happened in this room 3 days ago, that is not their military capacity. That is their basic condition. That is what it means to be human. He went back to his seat. The vote was not close. When the result was announced, there was a specific sound in the chamber that was hard to categorize. Not applause exactly, since most species present did not express approval that way, but a collective shift in atmosphere, a release of held breath across 40 different respiratory systems. Rael received the formal acknowledgement from the council chair. She said thank you, which she meant, and she took her seat, and she opened her notes to item 3, and she began going through her proposals for the Hethorvani border question, because the territorial dispute had not resolved itself in the past 3 days, and people's attention was going to move on from the crisis eventually, and there was still work to do. Saru leaned over. "You are remarkable," he said very quietly. Rael glanced at him. "I'm doing my job," she said. "That is what I mean," said Saru. The council chamber settled into session. Somewhere in the outer corridor, behind a patched blast panel, the station hummed at its proper frequency, even and whole and working correctly. For the first time in a long while, Vareth 9 felt like a place where the right people were in the room.